Why we're fascinated by murders, I've no idea, but we are. This is one that took place in 1638 in the small market town of Bridgnorth in Shropshire, where its residents are drawn to the goings-on between two neighbours, Elizabeth Williams and John Preen. Elizabeth Williams' husband, Richard Williams, a gentleman, had rented the house and stall adjoining his in the High Street to John Preen, a vintner. Soon Mrs. Williams and Mr. Preen were frequent visitors to each other's houses. But by January 1638, the relationship had soured. Angry exchanges were heard between the two, with John Preen insulting Mrs. Williams and accusing her of being a Welsh whore, amongst other things, and threatening at one point to put her heart in a kettle. You would have thought this was enough to make Mrs. Williams avoid John Preen, but she was attracted to him like a moth to a flame. On Wednesday, the 16th of January 1638, matters came to a head. What prompted this outburst, we don't know. But while Mrs. Williams was spinning in her workshop, what we would now call a shop, Preen came in shaking a whip at her. A tirade of abuse followed, with Preen calling Mrs. Williams a base, odious queen, i.e. a prostitute. And as a final flourish, he added that he had 5 bitches, but had only got 3 left. Mrs. Williams advised him that he'd better look after the ones that were left. As the day wore on, far from Preen's temper abating, it got worse. He jokingly asked his other neighbour, a baker, if he could borrow his pikel so that he could shake Mrs. Williams up. Mrs. Williams at this point had her suspicions that Preen was going to set fire to the house with her in it. And she went into his house on the 16th of January at 5:30 p.m. to confront him. Preen was furious. He was washing the floor at the time, told her to leave, and when she didn't, he threw boiling water on her back. Mrs. Williams left and went to a friend's house, telling a woman there called Margaret Clark that she thought John Preen was trying to murder her. Mrs. Clark told her not to provoke John Preen, advice which she obviously didn't take, because after leaving the friend's house at 7 p.m. with a candlestick on her arm and a tankard of ale under her apron, she went to Preen's house between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. And this was the last time she was seen alive. By Friday the 18th, Mrs. Williams still hadn't been seen, and John Preen asked the wife of a fellow shopkeeper if she thought Mrs. Williams had made away with herself. "My comfort," he added, "is that the key is on the inside of the door." On the 19th of January, John Blakemore knocked at the door of the Williams house, but John Preen told him he'd have to knock very hard because Elizabeth was either dogged sick or dead in the house. So where was Mr. Williams, one wonders? Was he away from home at this time? Perhaps that's suggested by a conversation the two men had after the body was found. Mr. Williams asked John Preen who was the first to discover his wife's body, and John Preen's answer was that it was the person who killed her. Another man present asked Preen who that was, and Preen's answer was a typical, "The devil for all I know." Bridgnorth must have been buzzing with questions and opinions. How did the murderer get into the house? And how did they get out with the key left on the inside? Indeed, was Mrs. Williams murdered at all, or did she commit suicide? It was left to the coroner to decide the cause of the death, and after hearing evidence from witnesses, he concluded that Mrs. Williams had indeed been murdered, but by whom he didn't know. Both Mr. Williams and John Preen were sent to Shrewsbury Jail to await their trial at Shrewsbury Assizes on February the 22nd, 1638. Sadly, the assize records haven't survived, and one is left to speculate on who murdered Mrs. Williams. I can clarify one point. If the murderer was John Preen, he was certainly not hanged for the crime. 10 years later, John Preen was a vintner, leasing land in Mill Street, on which he was going to build a house. So who was the murderer? Richard Williams or someone else? We may never know. If you want to follow this story further or look at the original records, they're actually held in Shropshire Archives, and the reference number is BB/F/4. They're coroner's records.